Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ever popular In Conversation series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Ronan Harris, who's joining us from London. Ronan is the VP and Managing Director of Google for Ireland and the UK. And the topic for the next 40 minutes is a really interesting one today. It's COVID-19, post-pandemic growth, the power of human potential collaborating with machine learning and data analytics. I'm glad you're here, Ronan, to talk about this today. But before we start, Ronan, great to have you with us. Let me just give folks an idea of your biography, because actually you're nearly with Google now 16 years, isn't that right?
I know. They haven't
It's
found me out yet. I keep dodging.
So currently you're Managing Director of Google UK and Ireland, and prior to this, Ronan was VP of Google EMEA and Head of Google's operations in Ireland. As you say, you're there now nearly 16 years, and since then you focused on the company's online advertising across EMEA and also launched several other Google products and initiatives in the region. UCD alumnus, graduate in electronic engineering at UCD. You began your career with Mitsubishi Chemical Corporation at their information storage products division in Japan. Spent 9 years in Japan working in consulting and technology, and then returned to Ireland in 2001 to work in private equity before joining Google in 2005. So, Ronan, good afternoon. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too. The UCD alumni bit was obviously the best part of that bio.
I'm sure it was. I'm sure it was. So, how have things, just to start off, how are things with you and how are things through COVID and Google? What's been happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a kind of strange and weird and wonderful time. But sitting in London, we feel quite fortunate now, particularly as I talk to my friends and family back in Dublin. We seem to be just kind of coming out of it that little bit earlier on the back of vaccines and so forth. Concern around the new variant that's popping up and seems to be spreading quite rapidly amongst younger populations, but
Sure.
hospitalizations haven't kicked in yet. So there's still plenty to be concerned about. But at the same time, there's definitely, we're all turning our minds to what's this new normal,
Yes.
what happens next, what part of what's just happened is here to stay, and what disappears, and what's the next wave of change that's going to hit us. So that's kind of the mindset in the boardrooms that I'm spending time with at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess that's a good place to start, Ronan. And just to say for those joining us today, if you'd like to ask questions, please pop them in the Q&A that you see at the bottom of your screen. And also please feel free to put comments or feedback in the chat function. When we finish at about 12:40, we try and include as many questions as we can to Ronan. But Ronan, that interesting question of what's going on in the boardroom, it must be a fascinating time for Google. I mean, COVID must have been a hugely fascinating development for Google as an organization. Can you maybe start there and tell us a little bit about what's happened?
Sure. The I mean, it clearly took everybody by surprise. For us, obviously, the pivot to working from home, there was an immediate flick of a switch, and we were all sitting in our bedrooms and kitchens and offices and trying to figure out what happened next. And we went, um, uh, certainly in the UK and Ireland, a little bit ahead of kind of government, or because we had seen through our other offices around the world the trends in the data. We knew what was coming, and we went early into lockdown to quite a few questions at the time. And we dealt with what every company was dealing with. Like, how can we possibly run a company with 150,000 people sitting in their bedroom? And first and foremost, I suppose if a digital first company like Google, if they can't make it happen, we were all in serious trouble. And I've been just amazed by how teams have responded, pivoted, demonstrated resilience, and how they've not just kept the wheels turning for us, but really lent into helping our partners and our clients understand what was going on around them and do the things that they needed to do to embrace that needed digital transformation. For some people, they were already on that journey, or they were already there.
Sure. Yeah.
But for an awful lot of people, it would kind of caught them on the hop. So it was it was yeah, all hands on deck
Yeah.
for the first few months.
Any learnings or any insights that if you were back at the beginning again that you'd now do differently?
Um, I think it's a great question, and we haven't quite done a post-mortem on that. We went into it knowing that you know, leaving the office was going to be the easiest part of it all. And we knew that returning to the office as a company was going to be the toughest, and we're just starting to go through that now. Our offices here in London are opening up. We've got the first kind of 20% of people who are using it, and by September 1st, we hope and expect to be back in full-fledged mode. I think the learnings are probably more on the people side. So how do you teach a scaled organization to deal with a crisis and a calamity like this and such a transformational shift? Now, we all have to do it, but I think thinking more about risk mitigation, risk preparation is something that's going to be much higher on the agenda of all of our boardrooms, I think, over the next period of time. I think the other thing that it taught us was, and we pride ourselves on being innovative and fast, but we realized that we can actually be even more innovative and fast. We were getting requests coming at us from all different directions, and we kind of, I think, even developed a new agility in our own sense of being able to triage those, deal with the ones, prioritize, and actually respond. And whether that was in partnership with health services or government services, and to be able to play our role in society and as a member of that, and helping everybody respond, as well as keeping our business and our business partners on track.
So when you mentioned the return to the office, and it's obvious the skyline in Dublin there is changing with Google Docs and the lovely new developments that you have down there. How do you envisage that return to office? And you know, when you say that you have a certain percentage back already in London, how do you envisage it for Google as a whole, you know, in terms of what's going to be your remote working policy? As you say, a lot of organizations are, I won't say struggling with it, but they're certainly challenged right now to think about how are we going to go back, or where do we go from here? What's perspective on that?
Well, I don't think we go back, right? So it's changed, and anybody who thinks this is an immediate return to the way things were back in March 2020, I think is going to be disappointed. And I'm already seeing that in, for example, how some people are responding to you know, job offers and recruitment drives. This question of flexibility is now part of the conversation. It never was before. For us, you know, I think coming into this, we would have had people on the full range of the spectrum in terms of there's no way we can have any remote working whatsoever, through to there might be some jobs that could be remote, but we really don't want that. And now we've all got a new learned experience where we know we can run the company, and it's changed our mindset. But we do, one of the things that we have identified as you know, we've missed over the last 14 months is that informal connectivity, where often it's where, you know, it's people coming together around a whiteboard and bashing out ideas, is where very often some of that great creativity comes. And we worry that some of the ways in which we're all doing meetings now has become too transactional. You know, we're all going every 30 minutes, not to Zoom calls, but to Meet calls. And we are kind of rattling through agendas and then, you know, on to the next video call. And that casual interference that happens as you're bumping into people in the cafe or around the water cooler, as they say, is missing. We want to make sure that that's continues to be part of who we are. So what we're looking at is, as a baseline, and it'll vary slightly for different teams and different roles, but as a baseline, we're looking at a 3-2, so an average of 3 days in the office and 2 out. We're introducing additional flexibilities around that, where maybe for a couple of weeks a year, folk might be able to work remotely if it suited them. And over time, we may identify a small number of roles that we're happy can be as productive and as functioning as possible from a remote location, and give people that option. So I think there's a lot of experimentation that we all have to do. And then when you start talking about things like 3-2, do you fix the 3? Do you make it flexible? What do you do if people are in the office and not in the office? What happens if you've got a sales team? Where does the client fit into that? And how do you... So there's a huge amount of new norms that I think socially as business leaders we've all got to figure out.
And do you think it'll change the way Google do business from here on?
Yeah, I mean, it has. I think it has changed. I think for all of us, as I go around, and again, the themes that we have are very common across the companies I'm talking to. Everybody's now talking about how do you be more agile and build kind of faster, better products. So everybody's seen what's happened in the world of vaccines and how quickly, actually, when people put their mind to it, we were able to sort that out. For us, we've got our own examples of that. Everybody's got a new focus on risk. Everybody asking the question, did we really sit down and think through all of the risks? Have we got the right mitigations in place? What is our crisis response in future? Underpinning that, better insights. Everybody is looking to how can they get better insights. That often leads to a conversation around data, digital transformation. So that's shot up the priority list for folk. And sustainability. And this is an interesting one, probably one of the more surprising ones when you stand back and look at all that's gone on over the last year. But the way in which sustainability has rocketed to prominence on not just the activists' agenda or on the media agenda, but on consumers' agenda. It's really affecting. We see this in how consumers are shopping today. And we've also seen the prominence shoot up in terms of how boardrooms are assessing what they're doing and the choices that they're making. So that was probably one of the more surprising themes that's come out of it all. But definitely a strong one.
Yeah. So just in terms of the Google Docs project, and obviously a huge project for Google under yourself, can you share where that's going now? Will it change in light of what's happened?
So the question that I'm getting a lot at the moment, because I've got a big project going on in London up at King's Cross too, and everybody's asking me, am I about to stop building and give up? And the answer is a categoric no. We've done a lot of modeling about what this new work environment, new ways of working looks like. And we don't have all of the answers, but the models say that we need as much, if not more space, depending on some of the choices that we make. Now, the one thing that does change is the format of those spaces is going to be very, very different. And that's something that is definitely going to change. So thinking through what's the work environment? What are the ways in which we can use technology to help when you've got a kind of a hybrid environment where some people are at home and some people are in the office? What are the ways in which we can use technology actually within the building to make the spaces more flexible? So there's a lot of work going on around that and some very exciting, innovative stuff coming, I think.
Great. Okay. And when you look at today's topic, Ronan, and in terms of what you're talking to there, and how fast, I guess, the world has had to adapt over the last, 18 months, what happens next in, outside of Google? What's your perspective on where to from here in the world? How are we going to go forward from here?
I mean, that's a huge question, right? So I think as I said, there's no going back. So we're in a new paradigm now. But some things, we obviously hit a peak of transformation and change, and we're in a crisis period. We've now got to figure out what's the new kind of normal of those behaviors. And I think that's kind of the way in which we're trying to think about it on each of these topics. You have the context, you can kind of tell what happened at the peak, but we're starting to get a picture of what the new context is. And then you've got the behaviors of people, right? and the behaviors are kind of driven by demand, by ability, what are the triggers that trigger those behaviors. And when you take those two things of context and behavior, you can start to figure out what are the behaviors in consumers in particular that are likely to endure, versus the ones that are like won't, right? Versus the ones that maybe with a little bit of encouragement and support that we actually want to encourage, that we want to try and make them endure. So we're trying to categorize the kind of consumer and business behaviors that we see into those buckets, using today's context with some of the things that might trigger those behaviors and categorize like that. I think why are we doing that? I think the reason we're trying to do that is what we've learned is it's all about insight. So how can you use data to generate kind of meaningful, actionable insight faster and sustain that over time? And we use a lot of that in how we use our search data as a great example of data sets that we use to try and look for those kind of two buckets of context and behavior, and see if we can figure out what those forward-looking things are. And then we'll use that data either in our own products or with our partners to help them figure out, well, what's going to sustain for you. Like an example on that would be, think about shopping. And we have all pivoted to shopping online, and indeed shopping with apps. So apparently, I was looking at some research yesterday, over 40% of us have done more than half of our shopping through apps on mobile phones, right? Now, for most businesses, they never thought we would get to that point for maybe 5 years or more. Will that sustain? Maybe not in totality, but some of it will. But when you look at the consumer behaviors like that drove that, and you dig into and dissect what's going on for consumers, there's part of that experience that they want to keep, right? So they like the things like having customer reviews and being able to compare. Lots of people like browsing for clothes online. The things that they don't like doing online are figuring out, do clothes fit? And how do they look and feel in real time? And I think there's a lot of opportunity in that, right? So if you're a retailer today, what are the things that you can sustain? And then there's question marks in there about how can you remove some of that friction? So what are the new innovations that we're all going to have to drive to take some of that new friction that has been identified out of the system, and that will create opportunity for folk to sustain and create leadership.
Are you seeing a difference in, when you start to segment and look at different age groups and that, when you say that 40%, is that across the board? Are you seeing people adapting, or is it particular segments of the population that are driving it?
So it's always, isn't the phrase that the future is here, it's unevenly distributed. And when it comes to new behaviors and new habits, it tends to appear in that younger kind of 18 to 34 population first. And what COVID did is it forced everybody to get on the train, right? So I don't think there's a grandparent left who doesn't know how to operate a Zoom call or to text and chat online with their grandkids, right? So it became again, this is one of the behaviors that we think to sustain. We've all developed new skills, new ways of doing things, and we've also learned that we can learn these new things. And I think that's, so we're never going to forget the behavior of how to do a Zoom call and the fact that it's great, especially for communicating with folk over long distance. It's great convenience, all the rest of it. I think the thing that we want to try and sustain for people is, hang on, I know I can deal with these new technologies. I know I can pivot in a crisis. I know I can transform and change, and I know I can do it quickly. So how do we keep on that journey? Because the only thing I can tell you is the rate and pace of change is not going to slow down. Hopefully it's not from pandemics going forward, but that type of dynamic environment is here to stay. And from our perspective, it's being done.
That's really interesting. And can I ask you what insights in terms of how consumers are making decisions, in terms of how customers are making decisions? Obviously, you do a lot of client work as well. How has that changed or how is that changing?
So one of the things that we saw, and we saw again this developing in a younger population before going into the pandemic, was a kind of a material shift to the traditional marketing funnel of, something triggering you to want to go and do your research and bring you all the way down through a marketing funnel where you'd follow this kind of fairly logical set of steps and you'd pop out the other end having bought something. And what we see now is, particularly in the online space, people are coming in, they have a thought about buying something and they come into this, what we call the messy middle, where they do research and then they evaluate. And they keep going through this cycle of research and evaluation in this kind of messy middle, gradually kind of honing down the comparators and the features and the benefits between multiple products, and then coming out the other end in a transaction. And the types of things that are influencing them on that journey have changed fundamentally to traditional marketing techniques, and very subtle nuances in how you present your products and services. It can create dynamic shifts in the success rates. So that's the kind of area of research and science that we've developed. There's a website if people want to look at it. If you do a search for decoding decisions by Google, and there's some really great research in there about what we found out. And I think there's even a book now that we've published. So we can send you paper too.
Really interesting. Okay. Connecting that then with where technology is going, and we're talking about machine learning, AI, and how we are going to advance forward in this world. Can you share with us what's happening in that space right now at the moment that's going to directly impact businesses as they go forward? Like, what are the big things coming down the track?
Okay, so I think maybe if we think about it in time frames, right? So the here and now, I talked about some of the consumer trends we're seeing. We all experience those in our day-to-day lives. So as businesses, we need to sit down and think about, how do I now react to that? And that needs to be in progress right now. So things like if you deal with the consumer market, how strong is your online presence? How strong is your app? How are you dealing with that? How are you going to prepare for this new privacy-centric world in a world of online? And have you got very clear strategy around that for your business? I think the next phase of it is more, I guess, broadly digital transformation. So that in the first instance is about how do you kind of upgrade your IT infrastructure, move to a cloud structure, and make sure that you're capturing literally every possible piece of data that you possibly can for your business. And as you, and that's for any business, that's a significant undertaking. It will take a long time to get it right. Then comes, I think, one of the most exciting developments, or exciting technologies, in fact, that humans are working on today is AI. And we're right at the very dawn of AI. But it's really going to allow massive changes in how we think about our products, think about our operations, think about our people in our businesses. And I think will also allow us to confront some of the biggest challenges that we see in the world today. Everything from designing new medicines, going to have massive impact on sustainability, and even in healthcare, where we're already doing some significant work here. So I think AI is the next thing that'll come, and it will have a seismic shift on businesses similar to the internet as it landed. And it'll seem kind of cute, remote, slightly insignificant or intangible to begin with. Then companies will start to pop up and figure out, well, how do I apply this new technology to this kind of old problem over here? And they'll get breakthroughs and new Googles and large companies will be created in the process. I'm quite certain of that. And then beyond AI, there's more to come, right? So the whole field of quantum computing is another one that is, again, even pre-dawn perhaps, and is right at the very early stages. We're still figuring out how do we build these incredible machines. We're on the cusp of the first practical applications of some of these technologies, but it's probably 5 to 10 years before it starts to hit us at scale. The first applications will be in pharmaceuticals. We're already doing some stuff in material science. And I think the impact on bioscience, healthcare, financials will be really fundamental yet again. So when you think about that and you think about, my God, there's like wave after wave after wave of this stuff coming at us, how are we going to cope? And, look at what we've managed to do in the last 14 months.
Sure, yeah.
And it came down to people, it came down to skills, it came down to, I guess, a relentless curiosity to want to go out and test these new frontiers and take some risks with your people and resources to go and play with them a bit.
Yeah, just on the quantum computing, I was just having a look at that myself, and I suppose just for people who mightn't fully understand it, and I'm not saying I fully understand it at all, but my sense is that in terms of the computers that we know it as today, that this quantum computing it has equal capability, but can process faster, quicker, more complicated, maybe processes it can actually do. Can you just explain in your view what is quantum computing?
Okay, so I'm not an expert in the field, but as I describe it, quantum computing is fundamentally different to how traditional computing works. And it's more akin to how nature works, right? So it actually feels about nature actually works at a quantum level. And the basis for it is it's no longer about ones and zeros, it's about ones and zeros at the same time, right? And that's a very confusing concept to try and get one's head around. But what it allows is for certain types of problem, it allows us to accomplish what might take a traditional computer thousands of years to crack. A quantum computer can do in a matter of seconds or minutes.
Wow.
And this concept is called quantum supremacy. And quantum supremacy was achieved for the first time a couple of years ago, where a traditional problem, which would have taken a computer 10,000 years, was done in a matter of hours. And that same problem is now down to a matter of minutes. We're at the stage with the hardware technology where, so one of these bits that in a traditional computer will be 1 or 0, but in a quantum computer can be 1 and 0 at the same time, which is kind of weird. We're trying to build stable machinery that will allow many bits to exist in parallel. And we're moving now at a point where we think we can see a roadmap to, we can see a roadmap to getting chips and processing units that will have tens of thousands, if not millions, of these processors or these qubits in a stable error-corrected state, which will allow just incredible advances in things like I talked about, battery technology, which we know is critical. We've got to get that done today. We can't be waiting around. Healthcare, new drug design and delivery, and the list goes on. So we're very excited about the potential of this to create fundamental change for humanity.
So bringing then that back to business, Ronan, in terms of organizations and where they are today, what does it mean for the type of skills, the type of people that are going to be needed, 5, 10 years time as this technology really takes off?
I think I'm not sure that we can predict that accurately. I think again, I come back to making sure that we have learnt how to learn is very important. Making sure that we've got continuous upgrading of skills amongst our workforce. This is a big problem today. no business is doing enough to upskill and improve the skills of their workforce, and there's a massive deficit today. And everything that I'm looking at in terms of forecasts tells me it's only going to get worse over, between now and 2030. So I think there's work to be done there, in the core education system all the way through third level, but also once people are in the workforce, they're going to need to have their skills upgraded on a continual, ongoing basis. Then there's the very specialist fields. You've got fields like quantum computing, where some of my experts tell me that when it comes to the leaders in the field, there's probably less than 1,000 people on the planet today who understand this, and a huge number of them sit in places like Russia and China. So when it comes down to the available population in some of these fields, they're very, very scarce. And so we've got to find ways to invest and encourage and get more people into these fields so that we can take advantage of the opportunities that are there. But for us, practically, I think it's about really doubling down on our ability to learn and making sure that it's constant.
Really interesting, yeah. And in terms of leadership today, then, I mean, for looking at, senior leaders across organizations that, find this, particularly in more traditional industries, find this more challenging, what would your advice be to them? Where do they start?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the thing that I've learned over the last year is just how much I can rely on my people to get it right. And the job that I have found I needed to do more of over the last year than ever before, and it was probably the most productive part of what I would do is helping them understand what are the priorities and how to make the trade-offs. And then after that, letting them take care of the rest. So, I feel very fortunate. I've got a great team, but we've really made this huge shift by just getting really, really crystal clear on what are the few things that we're doing. All of the other stuff, business as usual, we don't need to talk about that all the time every day. I trust you to keep an eye on that and let me know if there's problems. But these are the things that I really care about that are going to shift the business. And that's what I spend all of my time talking about. And that has helped create a clarity for people on the front line of the business, and also an empowering kind of shift to perhaps how we worked before, where a very metrics data-driven company, we would spend maybe too much time talking about stuff that was already under control and didn't need to be interrogated.
I hear sometimes with our clients and organizations that in Smurfit Executive Development that in one way, data gathering, data collection is not so much the issue. There's a lot of data there. The question is, well, what do we do with the data? How do we extract value from the data? And I suppose that brings us into the whole area of, leadership and sort of being strategically, in terms of this digital transformation. What are your thoughts on that, Ronan?
So I think you're right there. I think there's two things. I think it's very rare that I come across a business that's actually collecting all of the data that is available to it. And then for the businesses who are collecting a lot of data, they're usually not investing enough in the interrogation of that. And again, it kind of comes back to my learning wheel, right? So if you create this loop where you're gathering data, you're structuring it right, then you've got a team who are doing great analysis on it, and they're pulling out insights that are actionable for the business that in turn will feed this, will change the data coming in the other end and create this wonderful feedback loop. Now, there's art and science in this, right? So the bit of how do you what's the IT structure you need? How do you collect data across your business? Is I think there's good science behind that. When it comes to the analysis, I think there's good science, but turning analysis into insight is where a lot of the art comes in. And it's a little bit like if you find a brilliant programmer, sometimes they can do the work of 10 average programmers. And the same is true of brilliant analysts. So the folks who've got a broad set of experiences, who have that creative curiosity at their core, and who like playing with data, and are able to translate it into real world insight. Again, they are super valuable people that we don't create enough of in our universities yet, and our businesses, but they're the people that you need to inject into that. And until you feel you've got that wheel of kind of data analysis and insight continuously changing your business, you probably haven't invested enough time and effort.
How do you build a curiosity mindset then in business?
I don't know, and I think it's innate in some people. I think, and you need to find space to allow them to be curious and to celebrate failure. We have a big thing about being able to celebrate failure in our place. We've got all sorts of analysis and research that will tell you the more often you fail, the more often you succeed, and it's all about failing fast. I think we've all read those books, but it's very true. And I think it comes down to, as a business leader, it doesn't have to be just about your latest, greatest technology innovation. It can also be around, well, what's the new way your sales team has come up with analyzing data, or creating a pitch to a client, or dissecting a business problem, and making sure that they're encouraged to go and be curious about those things. And we spend as much time talking about the failed sales pitches that we have, and trying to figure out what are the kind of fun learnings out of them. And so creating that mindset is the environment for the mindset to flourish.
Sure.
But you can't force people to want to do it.
Yeah. So it seems to me, even though, from what you're saying, you would think if we were going down this technology route, that the room for creativity and art mightn't be necessary. But actually what you seem to be saying, if I'm hearing it right, is actually there's going to be a greater need for those type of skill sets in organizations. Yeah. Really interesting, isn't it? When we think about technology and we think about, there's a phase of destruction almost in every, industrial revolution. There has been a phase where jobs cease to exist, and then the question is what emerges from that. What type of positions, where do you see the demand for skills going in the future as we continue at this pace of change that you're talking about?
So I think, the science arena is still going to be incredibly important, and again, we need to see more investment and more engineers, more computer scientists coming out. But I think, often we think of science as either white coats or programmers sitting in front of screens all day long and bashing out code. I think when you look at the adjacencies to this, it's about the how do you use creative techniques to start to bring some of that to life.
Yeah.
So we have something that we call the Creative Academy, and that's probably the most effective. And this is about an environment and a way of thinking, and it's probably the most effective machine that we've created over the last few years, in trying to crack our client and partner business challenges. And it's about bringing in, the right people, creating that right environment and mindset, and then bashing through ideas until you get to some things that you think are worth testing, and then doing rapid testing out of that. And this, this Creative Academy that we've created, that we've done, and the technical sprints that we do, the type of problem-solving workshops that we do, that environment is never about following a routine. It's about being very open about what and where the ideas are that might crack that problem. I think bringing more of that into the learning environment and the work environment is something that will be critical. We're continuing to invest heavily in core computer science. We're trying to build partnerships with universities on some of these newer areas around AI and quantum. But then equally, the business side of things remains critical. We're still always going to need salespeople and customer service people, and people who can sit down and kind of think about, together in a room, think about the problems. We're not all going to be automated. So
That's good.
That's
Well,
overall.
that's positive to hear. Just, I suppose, before we move, I'm conscious of the time and it's moving very fast. It's a really interesting conversation, but I don't think I should move to questions before asking you about ethics. And we're constantly hearing about issues of data protection, GDPR, where technology is taking us. What's your, and I suppose your own, not necessarily Google, what's your own experience on that and what's your views on that going forward? How do we do this in an ethical way that's sustainable?
So it's a great question, and I've found more and more of my time over the last few years being involved in these conversations around difficult topics. What content is allowed online? What's free speech? What's not free speech? What's private and what's not private? And there was, I remember a dinner I had going back, it must be 3 or 4 years, but it was a dinner in Dublin with Vint Cerf. And Vint, if you don't know him, is considered the grandfather of the internet. So he led the research team that developed the IP protocol that's responsible for shooting all of our data around this network that we call the internet. And I had a very similar conversation with Vint, who's now in 70s. He's always wearing a three-piece suit and looks very dapper. But I said to him, Vint, I seem to be spending more and more of my time in these conversations where people are concerned with what we're doing. And, how do I fix this? How do I solve it? And he kind of smiled at me and knowingly said, Ronan, you can't. He said, we're now at a point where we've taken thousands of years of humans forming social norms, and we've taken then the few hundred years we have of forming legal norms, and we've come along with all of our wonderful technology in the last 25, 30 years, and we've turned them all on their head. And we've now got to figure out, what do we want? What are the choices that we want to make? And he said, it's not going to be you. He said, it's going to be your kids who are the first to grow up in a purely digital society, to grow older and not just be parents themselves, but to be grandparents. And it's only then that we'll have all gone through this full cycle of understanding how we want technology to be with us in our lives and the role we want it to play and the new social norms that we want to develop around it. So for me, this is about us being very much in the center of those conversations, many of which are kind of difficult and fraught, but making sure that we've got members from all aspects of society who come in and sit around and help as a collective decide, well, what do we want these new norms to be? What is, what data am I willing to share that makes sense, and how do I want it shared? And am I comfortable with then how it's kind of kept and the value that I get in return? So we're very focused on this concept of trust and transparency. We're changing the kind of some of the principles, or have been changing some of the principles at the core of how we develop to make sure that stuff is, secure by default. We want to make it private by design. So, and then we want to make sure that you're in control of what you do with your data. So I think it's about this thing of, security, being very clear about how data is used and making sure the consumer has always got control over what they do with it.
And from the Google point of view, can you share with us what way is Google advancing as a corporation in that regard?
So I think this design philosophy is now at the very core of what we're talking about. We are trying to, rather than just invent and kind of push stuff out, we're trying to create experimentation within the ecosystem around what the future of privacy might look like. So we've got things like Privacy Sandbox, which is already out there, and people can kind of become part of the collaborating around what does that future state of privacy look like in the online world. And so it's clear that we're moving away from a world of cookies today. So what does that new world look like? Is it one where there's no data exchanged? Well, that doesn't really work, because if you think of something like Google Maps.
Absolutely.
If you want to get from A to B, you've got to tell me where you are and where you want to go. If you want to get an answer from Google, you've got to put a query into the computer to get one back. But figuring out, making sure that you're in control, and figuring out, are you getting value in exchange for the data that you might be passing over to Google or any third party? And then if they hold that, are you in control of it still? And can that third party be trusted with it? So we're spending a lot of time talking about this, talking with our own users, talking about with our advertising partners, but also with governments, with regulators. Everybody is very focused on this topic right now, and I think for the right reasons.
Yeah, really interesting. So, Ronan, last question for me before we go to the Q&A. If you were back in, when you look back when you were in UCD, back late 80s, early 90s, in engineering, did you ever expect to be in this role? And, how do you see yourself going forward if you're still very young? So another 10, 20 years, where do you think you're going to be?
Well, Well, I can categorically say I never expected to be in this role, because I think back when I was in engineering, if I wanted to get an email account, I had to apply and kind of wait 3 weeks for a letter from the science department. And it was still a point when if I wanted to do a search, it involved walking across campus to the library and rifling through a card index, right? So it was a very different world. Where will we be 10 years from now? One of the things that I think I'll still be involved in, I think Google will still be a very exciting company then, when I see what we're investing in today on some of these cutting edge areas. But the part of my career I've really enjoyed is being on that kind of messy edge of translating new technologies into into businesses or into consumers' hands in a way that's really useful, and where it's kind of taking away friction or transforming some other aspect. So that's something that fascinates me, and I think that combination of engineering and business will keep me in that space.
Interesting. Well, you definitely have the curiosity mindset anyway. Let me just go to the chat and let's see here. So, Mark, hi, Ronan, thanks for a great session. Can I ask how you optimize your own ability to embrace, hang on a second, sorry, it's just stumped. There's more chat coming in, so it's just bumped down. How do you optimize your own ability to embrace the new paradigm to continue to think creatively and strategically amidst all the noise?
So I think, well, there's a couple of things. I think in terms of how I spend my days, I've become very good at using a framework called the 4Ds. So either don't do it, delegate it, defer it, or do it, right? So I try and look at everything and that pops into my calendar. I've got an amazing assistant who helps me triage that and make it happen. The other part of it is around the curiosity piece. So I'm always attracted and try and spend more time on the kind of what feels to me like the more interesting problems, and the stuff where there might be something new that we could find in it. And then I do a huge amount of reading of all of these kind of new areas that are popping up and try and figure out which ones are getting traction. And I just, that's, I guess, my curious. I've always been, on the bleeding out of new technology. So my house is full of gadgets that are defunct and have already kind of fallen by the wayside. But I just love playing with all of that new tech. So that probably keeps me plugged into stuff as well.
Very good. Another question here from Donal. In light of the cyber attacks in recent days on the HSC, do you think, Ronan, that cybersecurity and data protection can become competitive edges for firms in the future?
100%. And I think it's a great question. I think we're rapidly moving. We're already at a point where, frankly, it's no longer feasible to have a secure IT infrastructure if you are a small, medium enterprise or even a small or medium-sized country. I think it's now moved to a point where you've got to have, really scaled infrastructure that's protected by the very, very most advanced technology. And small scale kind of independent structures don't allow for that, basically. And I think that's one of the big drivers for people moving to cloud. We see them recognizing that this is a major threat, and the only way to mitigate it, unless you've got scale, is to transition yourself into a cloud environment, because those companies have the infrastructure, they have the scale, and they are able to defend against this type of stuff.
Interesting. And a related question to that from someone, how concerned should we be about the criminal hackers, going forward? How do we mitigate those risks as businesses, Ronan?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And I think globally, as the world kind of withdrew and went indoors and went online, so did the hackers, and so did the criminality. And there's always the opportunist, and the kind of the scammy type stuff. I think we are all collectively getting better at identifying that stuff using AI, using advanced computing techniques. I think there's more governments can and should do around this stuff. We talk to them about how we collectively can tackle some of these things. But we should absolutely be concerned. And I think, coming back to a lot of these technologies are very new, and what you've got is very often a knowledge gap. And the hackers who know the technology also know human engineering, and they're taking advantage of that knowledge gap. I know in my own house, my 12-year-old can spot a scammy email or scammy website faster than either of his parents. So he's, I think that finding ways to teach people how to recognize when something isn't quite right and to trust their gut. But unfortunately, criminality is here to stay. We won't be able to eliminate it, but we can do more to defeat it.
And for businesses that I guess, don't have necessarily, huge resources to think about that, where do they start? Where do they, as you say, cloud, it seems like a good option on that front. But what would your advice be to people here today in terms of what they should do going forward?
I think there's the infrastructure side of it, and I think cloud is the only answer there. I think then there's the education of yourself and your team, and making sure some of those basic protocols are followed. So, does every single one of your employees have two-factor authentication turned on for their email? Are they using passwords like password or 12345 or their date of birth, right? So are you enforcing those simple kind of basic tricks that very often are the first ways that hackers find to exploit a system? So I think that's kind of the immediate what you can do today when you go back to your desk.
Yeah. Question here from Gemma, kind of related to it, but do you ever see us coming to a point where you have to use a passport to verify yourself on social media platforms and be held accountable for your actions?
This is a long-standing area of debate, and there are very strong arguments on both sides of it. So on one side of it, I think, as the question poses, this thing around accountability for your actions online, that you should be held accountable online for what you do as much as you are held accountable offline, and you should follow the laws of the land. There are other very strong examples and cases of, for example, at one extreme end, if you're a dissident in a kind of autocratic regime and you're trying to counter that with information or reportage of what's going on the ground, and the ability to stay anonymous, A, protects your life, but B, informs the world. There are more kind of closer to home examples around this as well, around young people in particular who are potentially suffering from mental health difficulties. They want to have anonymity to be able to reach out very often for those first conversations. And this debate goes on and has raged for many, many years, and there's a lot of much more kind of thoughtful and well-researched people that can can share their views with you on this one.
Interesting. Somebody here, Ronan, would like you to go back over your 4Ds. They're very taken by it. Can you just reconfirm them to us?
Okay, so you don't do it, you delegate it, you defer it, or you just do it.
Great, thank you. And then, yeah, another question here. Do you feel that in-person meetings with clients will still feature, but it will be
Yes.
more of a hybrid of video calls and in person? Just a comment, there is a cost saving to doing the video calls, particularly cutting down on international travel. But do you see that there's a value to the in-person meetings which needs to be considered in the balance, those interpersonal connections?
So it's definitely a mix, right? So I don't think we're all going back to 100% in person. I think there'll definitely be more, particularly the transactional stuff that we want to do. You know, is it valuable to spend the hour commuting to and from a meeting when you probably could do it in a 15-minute video call because it's a transactional experience? Now, I think we've got to learn and adopt to, well, what counts as transactional and what doesn't.
Sure.
But this interpersonal thing, I think, is hugely important. People, you know, ultimately have to develop trust. They have to develop a relationship, and then they'll do business. And that needs to be at the core of everything. You know, if I think about myself, very often the most valuable part of a 2-hour meeting that I spent with a board of directors somewhere is the 5 minutes I spend walking to the elevator, because you get that little bit of kind of nugget of, yeah, that thing really landed well. I love that slide that you used, or you asked a great question, and that gives you the nugget to be able to come back, and you don't get that on a video call.
Very good. Well, Ronan, we're nearly at time, and from ourselves here in Smurfit Executive Development, it was great to have you on here today. I think you've stimulated a lot of food for thought, which is great. And you're always great in giving us your time, and really appreciate you. And I hope you will be getting back to Ireland a little bit more in the future, now that we're moving. We're not as fast as the UK at the moment, but we are moving in the right direction, I guess.
Absolutely. No, I'll be back. I'm definitely in my plans. So I look forward to seeing you all soon.
So thanks very much, Ronan, for joining us. And I would like to thank Michelle Burke and Mario Nunes for doing the technology behind the scenes today. And thanks to everybody for joining us. And we hope to see you in June for our next In Conversation series. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ronan. Goodbye.